Wars of Alexander the Great. These were right proper campaigns, led by Alexander, the king of Macedonia, in cahoots with the Greek states, all aimed at giving the Persian Empire a jolly good seeing to. Now, this Persian campaign, it was all set up by Alexander's old man, Philip, who'd been busy conquering Greece beforehand. Between 357 and 348 BC, Philip had snapped up all the Greek colonies along the Thracian coast, a fair bit of land grab. During this time, Macedonia also got its mitts on Thessaly, but the combined forces of Athens, Sparta, and Achaea managed to see off Philip's attempt to barge into central Greece through the Thermopylae Pass, a bit of a setback for him. In 342 BC, Euboea, Epirus, and Aetolia all rather sheepishly recognized Macedonian authority, didn't they? This got Athens a bit twitchy, where this chap Demosthenes, bit of a loudmouth, gained dictatorial power and cobbled together an anti-Macedonian coalition, a right rabble. In 339 BC, Philip, not one to be deterred, invaded central Greece. The decisive battle that sealed Macedonian victory happened in 338 BC at Chaeronea, a proper showdown. Facing the Macedonians were the armies of Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and a few other poleis, all led by Demosthenes. Both sides had a fair few troops, around 30,000 men apiece. The main punch was delivered by the left wing of the Macedonian army, under the command of Alexander himself, the young whippersnapper. They gave the band forces a right good thrashing, and that pretty much settled the whole affair. The Macedonian hoplites, being a bit better prepared, secured their victory, fair play to them. And after that, most of the lads who fought at Chaeronea ended up taking part in the Eastern campaign. Off they went. Philip, you see, had been planning a war against Persia, the richest state going at the time, no scrimping there. So, in 338 BC, Macedonia formed an alliance of all the Greek states, except for those stubborn Spartans, wouldn't join in, would they? But just as preparations for this Eastern campaign were in full swing, in 337 BC, poor old Philip got himself assassinated, nasty business. The army was then led by his son, Alexander, sharpish. In 336 BC, the Macedonian vanguard, led by Parmenion, invaded Asia Minor, first chaps over the fence. At this time, an anti-Macedonian revolt broke out in Thebes, where a small Macedonian garrison was besieged, a bit of a pickle. Hearing about this, Alexander, with the main part of the army, hot-footed it to Boeotia. He attacked Thebes, from whose citadel the besieged Macedonians made a sortie, a bit of a pincer movement. The city was captured, and a whopping 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery, a harsh punishment. While Alexander was sorting out Thebes, Parmenion had a bit of a rough time in the struggle against this Greek commander Memnon, who was working for King Darius, and in 335 BC was forced to retreat back to the Hellespont, not a good show. Alexander, who crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BC at the head of a 35,000-strong Greco-Macedonian army, saved Parmenion from a complete pasting, just in the nick of time. Although the Persians had a fleet that significantly outnumbered the Greek one, they couldn't stop the landing, not a chance. The Macedonian king left 12,000 infantrymen and 1,500 cavalrymen in Greece to keep things in order back home and see off any potential sneaky landings by the Spartans or Persians. Unlike those Greco-Persian wars of the 5th century BC and the Peloponnesian War, in this new dust-up between the Greco-Macedonian alliance and the Persian Empire, being top dog at sea didn't really matter all that much for how things turned out. Unlike the Balkans, the territories of Asia Minor and Syria, where the first battles took place, produced enough grub to feed Alexander's army, so no worries there. Memnon, a clever chap, suggested not bothering to fight the Macedonian army head-on but to retreat inland, destroying all the fodder and food supplies as they went. Then, when Alexander's army was a bit weakened, the commander proposed to give him a proper battle, gathering all the troops from the eastern part of the Persian state. However, Darius, not wanting to give up those rich Asian provinces without a fight, rather underestimated the strength of the enemy army, didn't he? The first proper scrap took place at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. Here, Alexander faced the most combat-ready part of the Persian army, the Greek mercenaries, a tough bunch. After the Peloponnesian War, mercenary service had become all the rage in Greece. Those old civil militias had pretty much turned into professional armies by the end of that war. Loads of Greek warriors, having spent over 20 years in pretty much continuous fighting, had got rather used to the military life. Finding themselves a bit out of work back in their own polis, they hired themselves out to the Persians. Fair enough. What's more, in King Darius III's army, the one facing Alexander's lot, there were Greeks from Persian-controlled Asia Minor, bit of a mixed bag. By the time Alexander's campaign rolled around, the Persian Empire was only really a shadow of its former self. Satrapies, these governor-bloke territories, had pretty much become semi-independent states, very reluctant to cough up warriors and supplies for the king's army, and what's more, they were all a bit hostile to each other, a right mess. Alexander, on the other hand, had a unified army from Macedonia and all the main Greek polis. The internal weakness of Persia was the main reason why Darius didn't dare to go with Memnon's plan, you see. After all, if the Persian army had retreated, loads of those satrapies might have just upped and joined Alexander without a fight, wouldn't they? In the Battle of the Granicus, the Greco-Macedonian army had the numbers on their side, a fair few more lads. Alexander had at his disposal 32,000 infantrymen and 5,100 cavalrymen. Darius could only muster about 20,000 foot soldiers, half of whom were Greeks, and no more than 3,000 Persian cavalrymen, a bit outgunned. The Persian troops took up a defensive position in some rather rugged terrain, protected by the Granicus, intending to see off the attack of the bigger enemy force. Alexander formed a phalanx of hoplites with an oblique wedge in the center and put cavalry and light infantry on the flanks, a clever bit of positioning. The strongest part of the phalanx charged across the Granicus and scattered the Persian archers before they could do much damage, sharpish. The Macedonian cavalry then scattered the Persian cavalrymen and then attacked the Greek mercenaries from the flank, who took the brunt of the losses, poor sods. Darius' army was forced to retreat, tail between their legs, sort of thing. In the Battle of the Granicus, the Greco-Macedonian army lost 85 cavalrymen and 30 infantrymen killed, a relatively small number considering. You could probably reckon that at least 500 were wounded, a fair few bandaged heads. There's no proper reliable info on the Persian army's losses, but they were certainly several times greater than the Greeks and Macedonians, no doubt about that. After the victory at the Granicus, Alexander's army captured most of the Greek cities of Asia Minor without so much as a scuffle, easy peasy. Only Miletus and Halicarnassus had to be taken by storm, a bit more effort. The Persians, under the command of that Greek bloke Memnon, managed to scarper from there by sea, clever escape. Memnon himself then popped his clogs soon after, a great loss for the Persian Empire. They lost their only real match for Alexander, didn't they? After capturing Miletus, Alexander sent pretty much his entire fleet back to the shores of Hellas. Didn't need it anymore, seeing as those rich cities of Asia Minor were providing a reliable supply line for the Greco-Macedonian army. Sorted. In 333 to 334 BC, the Macedonians occupied Caria, Lycia, and Pamphylia in southwestern Asia Minor without a proper fight, just walked in, they did. Then Alexander captured Cilicia and moved into Syria. Darius, meanwhile, came there from Babylon with a newly formed army, giving it another go. The next big dust-up between them took place in 333 BC at the Gulf of Issus in Syria, right on the Mediterranean coast. Both armies lined up on different banks of the Pinarus River, a tense standoff. The Greco-Macedonian army had more blokes overall and the advantage in infantry. The Persians had slightly more cavalry, but the battlefield wasn't really the best spot for them to maneuver. The Persian cavalry was stuck behind the river on the plain and could only really attack the enemy phalanx once it had already pushed back the Persian infantry, a bit of a disadvantage. Just like at the Granicus, the weaker army was more concerned with digging in than going on the offensive. At the start of the battle, Darius sent his personal guard and the remaining Greek units into the fray, a desperate gamble. They were backed up by Persian hoplites and archers, as well as cavalry. Alexander himself led the charge of the heavy cavalry on the right flank against Darius' personal guard, a bold move. After a fierce scrap, Darius, with his bodyguards, legged it from the battlefield, sharpish. At this point, the left flank of the Greco-Macedonian army was pushing back the Persian cavalry. Alexander then threw the Thessalian cavalry at M, who managed to send the enemy packing, routed M. After that, the Persian infantry, seeing their king had bolted, also made a hasty retreat from the battlefield, every man for himself. In the Battle of Issus, the Greco-Macedonian army lost 300 infantrymen and 150 cavalrymen killed, a fair few casualties. The wounded probably numbered at least 2,000, including Alexander himself. Got a bit of a scratch, did he? The losses of the Persian army were significantly higher, but there's no proper count, nor is there reliable info on how big their army actually was. Those figures Greek sources bandied about, saying Darius had 600,000 men at Issus, are about as believable as Herodotus' claims about Xerxes' million-strong army, a load of old codswallop. Although, mind you, even military geniuses like Napoleon Bonaparte, just 180 years ago, were taken in by such tall tales. The deposed French emperor, while stuck on St. Helena, asserted, "Victory isn't won by numbers." Alexander defeated 300,000 Persians with 20,000 Macedonians, bit of an exaggeration, that. The main thing about the Battle of Issus was that after getting a right pasting in their second big set-piece battle, Darius' army was well and truly demoralized, spirits were low. Most of the Greek mercenaries survived the battle, tough bunch. However, later on, according to various accounts, somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 of them left Darius and headed off to Phoenicia, from where they sailed back to Greece, sod's law. So, the Persians lost their best infantry, didn't they? Only a small detachment of Greeks retreated with Darius beyond the Euphrates, a loyal few. If we reckon there were about 10,000 mercenaries to begin with and only about 1,000 stuck with the Persian king until the end, the total losses of the Greeks serving the Persians in the battles of the Granicus and Issus can be estimated at about 1,000 killed and wounded, a fair whack. The losses of the Persian part of the army were likely several times higher, no doubt about it. Alexander captured a fair few prisoners. In his hands were the treasury and harem of the Persian king, as well as Darius' personal chariot, quite the haul. Part of the loot was nabbed in the Persian camp, and part in Damascus, which rather obligingly opened its gates to the victor, where the Greeks and Macedonians captured pretty much the entire Persian baggage train, right bonanza. Alexander's army then moved into Phoenicia. Most of the Phoenician cities surrendered without a fight, providing their fleet for the conqueror's use, rather helpful. The main base of the Persian fleet, Tyre, only fell after a 7-month siege in 332 BC, a tough nut to crack. The Macedonian king then had at his disposal the fleets of the Phoenician and Cypriot cities, a fair bit bigger than the Tyrian fleet. But Alexander had to overcome some stiff resistance from the besieged, building a causeway connecting the island where Tyre was located with the mainland, a massive undertaking. Only then could his army get close to the city walls and break the resistance of its defenders. The walls of Tyre were eventually battered down with the help of siege rams mounted on ships, bit of ingenuity. The city was captured when the walls were breached, 8,000 citizens were killed, and a whopping 30,000 were sold into slavery, a grim outcome. From Phoenicia, Alexander moved into Egypt. Judea swore allegiance to him, no fuss there. Only in the border town of Gaza did the Persian garrison, led by one of Darius' trusted chaps, Batis, put up a proper fight. After a 2-month siege, all the defenders of the fortress were killed, a stubborn lot. Egypt, however, surrendered to Alexander without a fight, and the local priests willingly recognized his divine origin, rather flattering. The remaining Greco-Macedonian detachments in Asia Minor saw off Persian attacks launched from Armenia and Mesopotamia, kept them at bay. Darius then offered to make peace, offering to hand over part of the Asian coast and pay a hefty ransom for the prisoners, including his own family, a desperate plea. The Persian king was even willing to form an alliance with the conqueror, but Alexander, being rather ambitious, demanded complete surrender, insisting that the King of Kings should come to him as the true master of all Asia, no compromise. Darius, in response, proposed to divide his empire, giving Alexander all the Mediterranean provinces he'd already conquered, a fair offer, you'd think. But the Macedonian king wouldn't budge, stubborn as a mule. So, Darius gathered all the remaining troops he could muster on the approaches to Babylon, his last throw of the dice. Alexander, in the spring of 331 BC, set off from Egypt on a campaign deep into Persia, heading for the heart of the empire. Near the village of Gaugamela, north of Babylon, the last major battle of this war took place, the final showdown. Darius' army now consisted almost entirely of blokes from various Asian nationalities, a real melting pot. For the first time, the Persians intended to use 100 war chariots fitted with nasty sickle-like knives and 15 elephants against Alexander, a bit of a shock tactic. The size of the Persian army is a bit of a mystery, but it's unlikely to have been more than 30,000 men, considering the losses in previous battles, the desertion of the Greek mercenaries, the enemy occupying half the empire, and the rather limited ability of the eastern satrapies to cough up troops. Alexander, having received reinforcements from Greece and managed to recruit more lads in the cities of Asia Minor, had a fair-sized army of 56,000 men this time, including 4,000 cavalrymen and 30,000 hoplites, decent force. The Persians had the edge in cavalry. Delbruck reckons they had up to 12,000 horsemen, a fair few. The number of Persian infantry was only slightly more than that. To counter the enemy's cavalry superiority, Alexander arranged his army so it could fend off attacks from all sides, a clever bit of planning. The Persians started the battle with an attack of those war chariots and elephants, followed by their cavalry, a fearsome sight. However, the Macedonian and Greek archers and slingers managed to take out most of the charioteers and elephant drivers, good shooting. The now unmanageable animals bolted and trampled their own Persian infantry, a bit of a disaster for them. Part of the Persian cavalry did break through the formation of the Greek light infantry on the left flank but then ran into the phalanx of Macedonian hypaspists, shield-bearers, warriors with longer spears than your regular hoplites, and were stopped in their tracks. At this point, on the right flank, Alexander, leading the Macedonian cavalry himself, broke through the formation of the enemy's heavily armed infantry and came face to face with the Persian king's personal guard, a right royal confrontation. Darius, bless him, couldn't take the pressure again and legged it from the battlefield, scarpered once more. The Persian troops, hearing their king had done a runner, started to retreat in a right old hurry. Alexander then rushed to the aid of his left wing, commanded by Parmenion. There, the enemy cavalry was giving the Greco-Macedonian infantry a bit of a hard time. Part of the Persian horsemen even broke into the enemy camp and started looting, a bit opportunistic. So, they missed their chance to attack the phalanx from behind, a costly mistake. Alexander then slammed into the Persians who were attacking Parmenion's lot, hitting them in the flank and forcing them to retreat. The retreat soon turned into a right rout, a disorderly flight. Loads of Persians were killed by the Greco-Macedonian cavalry or taken prisoner, a proper pasting. Alexander's army lost about 500 men killed, a relatively small number considering the scale of the victory.